In the previous video, we looked at the way that God reveals himself through angels, and we use this as an example of a general principle. In this video, we're going to look at the way that this principle works out in Jesus. So here we are with the picture we saw in the previous video. We've got God, one God in heaven, and this God dwells in unapproachable light. We can't see him, we can't visit him, we can't hear him or converse with him. So there's mankind below. We're too weak to experience God directly. No man shall see me and live, says God. And in fact, no one has ever seen God. So it looks like we're separated from God. Now, God has overcome that. He's found a way in which he can show people what he is like. And he does this by using other beings who are not themselves God. And in the other video, the previous one, we saw how God reveals himself to mankind through angels. Well, angels aren't God, and God reveals himself through beings who are not themselves God. And we saw that with angels. He does it through prophets. He does it through other human beings as well, but prophets are a big one. And the third one we're going to think about just now, and the one we're going to make this video about, he reveals himself through Jesus Christ. And this same principle that works in angels, works in prophets, and works with Jesus. So God is in heaven, mankind is on earth. Man can't see God, he can't experience God directly. What happens? Well, God can use another being to convey his presence, to show his word, to act on the earth. And angels, we saw that in the previous video, they do that job. He also does it through Jesus. In fact, Jesus does it even better than the angel. What we might describe those as his agents. So the angel is the agent of God. Jesus is another agent of God. Prophets are agents of God. The agent does what the principal wants the angel, the agent to do. And as a result, we get a message from the principal. So the angels show us what God is like. Jesus shows us what God is like, and in fact does it better than the angels. And in fact, this principle is written out for us explicitly. It's in John 1 verse 18. If you take the majority text, the overwhelming majority text, it says, "No one has ever seen God. The only Son who's at the Father's side has made him known." And that's the point about Jesus. He has made God known. Also described for us rather more detail in the first chapter of the book of Hebrews. In fact, the letter to the Hebrews, first 4 verses give this nice little summary. So it starts off by saying that long time ago and at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. So he's talking about Old Testament times, and the ancestors of the people that were being written to in this letter had God revealed to them. But God had revealed himself to mankind in many different occasions, many different times, and he'd done it in many different ways. But now he has revealed himself to us through Jesus, his Son. And he's talking about this in the same way it talks about God revealing himself through the prophets. Notice, by the way, that Jesus has been appointed heir. It's not talking about the nature of Jesus. It talks about Jesus have been selected to fulfill this role by God. And there it talks about created the world. Well, the world it's talking about is the world to come. If you go to Hebrews 2 verse 5 and have a quick look, you'll see that that's the word that this letter is speaking of, at least in the early part. So it's saying that God, who's spoken to us through various different ways to the prophets, speaks to us now through Jesus. And he goes on. It describes Jesus as the radiance of God's glory, and it describes him as the image of God. Now that word there, exact imprint, it's talking about an exact image, the sort of thing you got on a coin, stamp on, hit it with a hammer, it made an imprint on the coin, which was the image of the emperor on the coin. And there you go, there's a picture of the kind of thing it's talking about. There's the image on the coin. This one is Tiberius Caesar, the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus. It talks about Jesus then sitting, having gone to heaven and sitting on at the right hand of God in heaven. And it's describing someone who isn't God. He sits at the right hand of God, but reveals God to mankind. In the video on angels, we saw various characteristics that angels who are revealing God show. They speak God's words, they speak for God, they speak as God, they perform God's actions. When they're speaking for God, they might use God's name, and they might even be described as God. The angel does something, might be described as God doing something. We can see lots of examples where that happens with angels, where people mistake the angel for God acting directly. Now let's think how Jesus fits in this same picture. So, first of all, Jesus speaks the words of God. Here his own description of who he is. He says he's a man who has told you, the people he's talking to, the truth that he heard from God. And that is Jesus' own description of himself. That's what he does. That's what he's saying. It's the truth that he heard from God, which he's passing on to human beings. Notice that it's the truth he heard from God. It's not the truth he heard from the Father. It's the truth he heard from God. Of course, God is the Father, but he's absolutely certain, if you think about Jesus as being one member of a Godhead, the Father being another member, then that wouldn't work, because Jesus is a man who's heard the truth from God. He didn't hear it from himself. He heard it from God, and God is here, the Father, not the Son. There's another one. The words that I say to you, I do not speak of my own authority. It's the Father who does the works, and it's the Father's words. There's another one, John 14:24. The word that you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me. God has given Jesus words that he can then say to people on the world. So Jesus is telling us that he spoke the words that God gave him to say. That's what these passages are telling us, and there are many others that tell us the same thing. Another thing, Jesus performs the actions that God gives him to perform. The Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. That's what he's saying. So he's telling us that what he does comes from God. He even goes on and says, I can do nothing of my own. Everything that Jesus does comes from God. It's interesting because as he says, I can do nothing of my own. Could God say that? Well, God can't. God can do anything, but Jesus can only do things that are given him by God. Can do nothing of his own. Jesus even does things that are thought of as being directly the province of God. These are things that only God can do, apparently. So there's an example: a man's let down through the roof, and when he comes in front of Jesus, let down in front of Jesus, Jesus doesn't heal him straight away. What he does straight away is say this. He says, take heart, my son, your sins are forgiven. And Jesus is forgiving sins. And the Pharisees, who very often got the wrong end of the stick, said, who can forgive sins except for God? And well, they often did get the wrong end of the stick, and here they definitely have, because it goes a little bit further down and describes what's actually happened. When the crowd saw it, they were afraid, and they glorified God who had given such authority to men. God gave to Jesus the authority to forgive sins. So just as an angel forgives sins in the Old Testament on one occasion at least, God has given Jesus the authority to forgive sins also. What about using God's name? That was one of the things in that table. Well, Jesus has the right to use God's name, certainly, because of his obedience, even to the point of dying on the cross. God has raised Jesus up and given him the name that's above every name. That must be the name of God. That's the greatest name there is. So Jesus has been given the right to use the name of God, but he almost never uses that right. Rather strangely, Jesus doesn't use the name of God. It's not described in that way in the letters or in the Revelation or even in the Gospels for that matter. Why not? Why does Jesus not use God's name? Well, to some extent, you have to speculate here because there's no direct statement of it, but I would suggest that it's to avoid confusion. Jesus doesn't refer to himself by the name of God because he wants us to know that he is not God. So he doesn't use God's name. Is he described as God? Angels are described as God in action. Jesus, on the whole, is not. He's never unequivocally described as God. Occasionally people bring up possible places where he might be, but if you look at them closely, you tend to find that those passages don't refer to Jesus as God at all. Jesus, rather interestingly, at one point he's accused of making himself out to be God, and he answers by saying, well, that's not how it works. I'm not calling myself God. And he talks about a passage from the Psalms. It's Psalm 82. Is it not in your law? I said, ye are gods. And the people that are being described as gods here are people to whom the word of God came. And if you look at what they do in the Psalm, they judge people. So it looks like these are the judges who have been given the law by which they have to judge from God, but they're referred to as gods. They call themselves gods, or they were allowed to be called gods. But Jesus only refers to himself as the Son of God. He's not described as God. There's nowhere in the New Testament where Jesus is described as God. And again, why? Well, I think it's there because it avoids confusion. It stops you confusing Jesus with God. So just put the results together. We saw in the angels video how angels speak God's word, speak for God, speak as God, perform God's actions, use God's name, and are described as God on occasion. All those happen in the Old Testament description of angels. But when we look at Jesus, it doesn't happen. Jesus certainly speaks God's words. He speaks for God on occasion. He performs God's actions. But he doesn't speak as God. He doesn't use God's name, and he's not described as God. In spite of that, Jesus is a better revelation of God than the angels are. Even though he doesn't show as many of those characteristics as angels do, he's a better representation of God. I have to say, why would I say that? What way is Jesus better as a representation of God than angels are? Well, one way is that Jesus is a permanent representation of God. The angels from time to time represent God. Don't know how often any individual angel will do it, but only occasionally do you find an angel revealing God, and then just for a short period of time. Jesus revealed God for a long time and is still revealing God later on, things like the Revelation and appearance of Apostle Paul after he was raised to heaven. So Jesus is a permanent representation of God, while the angels are not. The other thing, of course, is that Jesus is the Son of God, angels appointed by God, but they are not God's Son. Jesus is the Son of God, and that makes him particularly close to God. And as a result, Jesus is a better representation of God than any other way that God is represented. And the Bible goes on to describe Jesus as the image of God. You get this several times in the New Testament. It talks about Christ, who is the image of God in 2 Corinthians. Colossians 1 describes him as the image of the invisible God, described as the firstborn of all creation. Firstborn, of course, the word really means most important, the highest of all creation. Of course, if you're the firstborn of creation, that means you're part of creation, rather interestingly. Philippians 2 verse 6 describes it as being in the form of God. The word there is morphe. It's talking about as a three-dimensional image, like a statue, but it's talking about the shape, not the nature. So you can have something that's in the form of the emperor. It would be a statue of the emperor, that particular word. It wouldn't be the emperor, it would be a statue. And Jesus is the form of God doesn't mean he is God. Hebrews 1 verse 3 already talked about. It's this idea of being stamped out with the exact image, the way that a die with the image of the emperor on would make an exact copy of itself on the coin. And because Jesus is the image of God, he could said, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. So you look at Jesus and you know what the Father looks like because you're looking at the image. If you look at the image of me at the top right hand of the screen, then nothing like handsome enough, but there we go. You can see what I look like. But the important thing about an image is the difference between the image and the substance. So the word there for image, Christ is the image of God. The word is icon, good word for people using a computer. And it's a word that appears elsewhere. So when Jesus asked the scribes and the priests for a coin, they gave him a tribute penny, and he said, whose is this image and superscription? And this word image is the same word. It's this word icon. So there you go. There's a tribute penny. It's a coin similar to the one that they would have provided for Jesus. And there is the image of the emperor on the coin. But the image is not the substance. That is the image of the emperor. It is not the emperor. There's a picture of an emperor sitting on a coin. That one is the image of an emperor on a coin. You mustn't confuse the two. They're quite different things. So you can have the image on a quite small coin, you need a big coin to actually fit the emperor on. But there we have it. And again, it's this thing, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. You look at the coin, you can see the image of the emperor, you know what the emperor looks like. So let's summarize what we've seen. There's a handy summary for us in John 1 verse 18. No one's ever seen God. You can't see God. If you want to know what God is like, the Son is the perfect image. The only Son who's at the Father's side, he has made him known. And there's the diagram to have a picture in your mind. God in heaven, man who can't see God, and angels and Jesus acting as God's agents who show us what God is like. Jesus doing it rather better than the angels do. But Jesus isn't just an agent. He's a mediator. So he's one up on the angels already. What do we mean by a mediator? Well, the angels show what God is like to human beings. So human beings can get an idea of God by seeing what angels do. Not a perfect view, but it's a good idea. Jesus shows us even better what God is like. You've got the express image, the exact image of God. You can see exactly what God is like by looking at Jesus. But Jesus does another job as well. He shows God what mankind could be like. Jesus represents God to human beings, and he represents human beings to God. He's the mediator who stands between God and mankind. I hope that is a reasonable explanation of how God reveals himself through Jesus. And I hope you enjoyed listening to it if you're looking at the video. If you did, then you can always subscribe. Remember, there are plenty of other videos on this channel. You can have a look at those as well. If you like the video, there's a button you can click on to tell us that you liked it. And there's a notify button if you want to be notified when the next of our videos comes up, as they do every Monday at 8 o'clock. So thanks for listening, and may God bless you always.